And we are recording. Good afternoon and welcome to this 14th week of this Zoom webinar devoted to the 2020 presidential election. For those of you who are new, and I'm glad to say that we do have some new viewers and glad to have you aboard as we look towards the end of the semester, but we're glad to have you for this week with our foreign affairs emphasis. My name is Joel Cassiola, and I am in the political science department, and pleased and honored to be the host of this Zoom webinar. Before I introduce our guest panelists this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the third quiz and ending the semester. But before I do, I want to welcome you back from Thanksgiving holiday and hope that your time off was enjoyable and safe. And those two need to go together as the virus surges not only through our country as a whole, but sadly through the Bay Area as well. The third quiz is up on the iLearn page, and it is the final assignment for the semester for enrolled students. The conclusion or the closing of the access to the quiz is December 7th at 11:59. So please take the third quiz before then. And remember, it is only on 2-week panels, 2 weeks of panels, panels 9 and 10, which had to do with foreign affairs. The week 9 was on Russia, China, and Iran, and week 10 was on Latin America, Middle East, Israel, and Palestinians, and Europe. So you are only responsible for 2 panels instead of 4, like the other quizzes. If your average at the end of 3 quizzes is 70 or above, you have completed the course and earned credit. If your average is not up to 70, then please write me, and I have created an extra credit assignment to help you improve your average. And it is to summarize 1 week of panels 1 through 10, and you can choose any one you wish and just indicate the main points of the speakers for that week. If you're in that situation, I would advise that you write me on email and we could arrange how you will do the extra credit assignment before the semester concludes. With that, I hope all of the administrative questions you might have about the course are answered and clear. If not, please write to me on email. Today, we are looking ahead to the new Biden administration in the area of foreign affairs. Officials that the president-elect might make, priorities that he might have in foreign affairs, and specific policies that he might seek to implement in the next 4 years. We have 3 members of our distinguished Department of International Relations, my colleagues, and I will start off with introducing The first speaker, Amy Skenesny, who is a member of the International Relations Department, a professor in the department. Amy has earned her PhD from the University of Minnesota in political science. And two publications, recent ones, that Amy has authored, Teaching Writing as a Social Justice, appeared in a collection by Palgrave Macmillan in the year 2020. And she's also written on populism and trade, the 2016 US presidential election, and the death of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which appeared in another collection published by Palgrave Macmillan. So with that, thanks to all three members of the panel, and thank you, Amy, for agreeing to share your ideas about the new Biden administration. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Cassiola, and it's great to be with all of you. Thanks for joining, and for this today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the future. So of course, you know, one of the things that we do in IR occasionally is think about what's to come, and we often look back at the past to make references to, you know, what can we anticipate. So there are some things that we can think about now, even though, you know, it's still a ways until Biden actually takes office. And so I'm going to present, I have some slides here. Actually, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to present a little bit of an overview of what I think Biden's foreign policy priorities are, and primarily look at how we can think about a President Biden in comparison to what we've had, especially from President Trump. Okay. So I thought I'd start out, and hopefully this gives us some context for the discussion today with my colleagues from my department, with thinking about what it was like in 2016 when President Trump came into office, because in a way, we were familiar with Joe Biden. I mean, he was President Obama's vice president. So this is a person that we've seen in a executive role before, and arguably he has the most foreign policy experience that we've seen in an executive leader as president in decades. So he comes in well-versed in foreign policy issues. And we can look back at the Obama administration. Actually, many people have commented that they think Biden's likely to continue a lot of Obama's policies. So in order to do that, we kind of have to take a step back to Biden, to Obama, to think about, you know, what was going on at that time, and then what happened when Trump came into office. So I like to call this Trump's foreign policy U-turns, because he, of course, in many ways reacted to President Obama when he got into office and immediately started taking actions to do a U-turn in American foreign policy and, of course, domestic policy, as you guys already know. So I just put this extra him because in many ways, he was the antithesis of Obama and wanted to undo a lot of Obama's legacies, including things like withdrawing or renegotiating US agreements. This was one of his first actions he took actually on day one, where he unsigned, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a 12-country member trade agreement that Obama had worked on for 8 years. And it was considered his signature trade, accomplishment. And of course, Trump unsigned it right away. He, over time, planned on renegotiating other trade agreements like NAFTA, which he did. He's withdrawn from US institutions, most recently the World Health Organization, as an example. He withdrew from the Paris Accords. So in many ways, he did a U-turn in terms of engagement. And I'll talk a little bit about what this meant for Trump's foreign policy. So that was one of his agenda. The other thing is, as you're all well aware of, is he wanted to restrict immigration. I think that was, something that he did accomplish. So many people can argue, what did Trump do? He had 4 years. What kind of impact did he have on foreign policy? And he did have impacts. There were things he didn't do. There were failures, obviously, just like any president. But he did do several things, including restricting immigration and really implementing harsh immigration policies across the board in lots of different countries, not just at the border, although that, of course, is one that you're all probably aware of, with separations from families, of children being taken from families, et cetera, having people wait out their asylum cases in Mexico, things that were really, were just unthought of before in US foreign policy were changed under the Trump administration. He also rolled back regulations. This was another one of his plans, and this was a big U-turn from the Obama administration, who had put in lots of, especially related to climate and climate change policies. The Trump administration wanted to roll back a lot of these regulations and make it easier for businesses to function in some ways, but in other ways pollute, whether it was coal or oil and gas, drilling, those kinds of things. And lastly, and I think this is probably a point where Biden wants to start, is that he also challenged American foreign policy to rethink traditional alliances and whether they were really worth having or not, and to think about new transactional partners that were maybe more temporary and in some cases unsavory. So he, for example, challenged many European leaders and relationships over the last 4 years. He didn't go along with the traditions. He met with leaders that Obama wouldn't meet with, and made it possible to think about, can you have a transactional relationship, for example, with Saudi Arabia? So these were things that really unmade a tradition of US alliances, particularly with Europe. I think probably most importantly with Europe. He even suggested that maybe NATO wasn't worth it, and other kinds of things that were just, you normally would never hear from an American president. So this is kind of the U-turns that have taken shape over the last 4 years. And it creates this atmosphere where now Biden is coming in many ways, leapfrogging over Trump from an Obama administration. And now what is he going to do? What are going to be some of his priorities? So I looked back to think about, what did Trump say when he was running in 2016? And then what did Biden say as he was running of this last year in terms of what they say about foreign policy? And sometimes you can look and see what they say on the campaign trail and say, okay, here's their priorities. Here's how they see the world. And then you can draw inferences about how they might lead. So I look back at Trump's speech. It's interesting, both of them they did a foreign policy speech, so-called, in around the same time of their campaigns. So it was in April 2016 that Trump gave his speech, and Biden gave his in this last May. And if you look at what they prioritized, you can read the transcript of the speech just by Googling it, or it was also posted in the newspapers. Trump, of course, you guys know his slogan of "Make America Great Again." And then Biden's, interestingly, the title of his foreign policy speech was America should lead again. So they kind of have something similar going on here with again, as if something has changed from before and not gone well, and now we need to get it back. But they have very different views of what that means. So for Trump, of course, this is the outline in this speech of what became his America First policy, or what some people call Trumpism, which is a way of thinking not just about, in some ways it's isolationist, meaning it's a retreat from engagement with the world to some degree, but it also has a lot of other meanings, because it doesn't mean totally withdrawing from the world, obviously, but to really think about what kinds of interest does America have, and are those partners, or are those trade agreements, or are those issues meeting US interests, and that those should be prioritized no matter what. So in his speech, he talked about putting America first. He talked about renegotiating trade agreements that he thought were bad deals that Obama had negotiated primarily, but also NAFTA, which was under Clinton. And even the first George W. Bush started that, or George H.W. Bush started that negotiation on NAFTA, but that these were bad trade agreements because they didn't prioritize American interests. They were too much of a compromise. And then his last pillar, I think, of Trumpism and his America First policy has to do with something called respecting sovereignty. You see this a lot in his speeches early on, and during the campaign, he talked a little bit about this. In his national security strategy, he talks about this. This really has to do with, I think this has to do more with isolationism, that each country makes their own decisions, and that the US should respect that and not intervene. And that's really what respecting sovereignty means here. We should not intervene. For example, in Syria, if the Syrian government decides to gas its own people or use chemical weapons on its own people, we shouldn't intervene there. If there's human rights abuses that are egregious, we shouldn't intervene there. We don't tell other countries what to do, and then we also aren't told what to do. So this is kind of where Trump came from with this Make America Great Again. Now, Biden, in contrast, is really talking about restoring, sometimes called moral leadership. He's even used those terms. Let's restore America's moral leadership, or we need to lead again. So he sees that the America First policies really took the United States out of a leadership role in the world, and that this is a real mistake. So he wants to return to what some people call liberal internationalism, or being engaged in the world and really seeing the US as a moral leader and as a partner. So I think one of his priorities, according to his speech, is to restore US leadership and renew US democracy and institutions. Those institutions that Trump withdrew from, he's planning on re-entering, and therefore getting the legitimacy, I think, of having the US involved and using institutions in cooperation to push American interests abroad, and also to cooperate with others and see what their interests are. So it's not only about just what the US wants, but how can we work together for common goals. And then another pillar of it was to protect US economic future, which of course I think is at stake right now, especially with the coronavirus pandemic and what's going to happen as there's, the US economy, is it going to recover or not? And there's long lasting damage, I think, to the US economy that he's worried about, and the global economy, actually. So if we look at what he said, especially in contrast to Trump, now what can we say about then how is he going to lead? Or what does this mean for foreign policy? So when in foreign policy analysis, or in the field of foreign policy and IR, in international relations, we talk about things like leadership style or tone, or whether you're going to use soft power or hard power, things like that. And I think we can draw some of these things just by looking at what Biden has already done and what he said. And then, of course, what he was like as a vice president and what he's like as a person. His personality comes through as you've gotten to know him over these last 2 years as he's been campaigning. One big contrast that jumps out, of course, if you watched his acceptance speech, is his tone. He's got a completely different affect than President Trump. I think the theme of his acceptance speech was unity. It was really about trying to unite the United States, which of course is difficult right now, but it's also really about an optimistic worldview that sees cooperation as possible, and that there is common goals among especially Democratic allies. He's a centrist, as you know. I'm sure many of you would have preferred a different candidate from the Democratic Party, for example. He's in the middle. He's a centrist. So he's thinking about uniting even the parties, like the Democrats and Republicans working together. Again, this has a huge impact on whether certain foreign policy goals can be met. If the Republicans don't go along with things, then it makes it more difficult for Biden to achieve his foreign policy goals. So he's going to try to work with them, I think. He's worked with them in the Senate, and he's probably going to try to do that again, much like Obama tried to do, especially in his first term. He really is democratic in that he sees democratic values as critical. So he's going to want to promote democracy abroad, whereas a lot of people condemned Trump, and he's still not conceding, right? So he's making accusations about our own democratic systems. And of course, this doesn't look very good for other countries around the world when you're trying to say that democracy is a good thing, that it does work, if your own president is saying it's not working and it's corrupt. So he's going to try to restore faith in democratic systems. And this is broadly speaking, both in our country, I think, and abroad. And then he sees sort of universal values. He sees goals that we all share, human goals of our humanity. And he's going to try to appeal to these. So this is about his tone, his approach. Whereas Trump, had a very different tone. He was more dark. He was more negative. He used different tactics. And you can see that both in if you think about his first inauguration speech. It was kind of shocking if you go back and watch it with his tone after a very optimistic Obama administration, which centered around hope. And now we see Biden focus on unity. So in many ways, you see that continuity, I think, between Obama and Biden. Then if you take his style, so the other thing we study in foreign policy is the style of the leader, because of course, presidents are people. So they have their style. How do they work with others? How do they operate, for example? Of course, we see huge contrasting styles between Trump and Biden. Biden's been around a long time. He's been in government for decades. He was in the Senate forever. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee way long before he was vice president. Then he was vice president for 2 terms. He knows the government really, really well. He knows how the Senate works. He's bureaucratic. He knows how the institutions work in our government. And he also has been around the world because as vice president, he led a lot of initiatives around the world and traveled and met with other leaders, et cetera. So he knows how things work in government. So whether that's good or bad, that's his style, is to try to use the levers of government to get things done. He's congenial, he's friendly, right? He's got that kind of, I don't know, aw shucks style a little bit. He's friendly and he wants to get along with folks. He's not combative or argumentative. He's inclusive. You can see this in the way that not only did he pick Kamala Harris as his vice president, but I think he's inclusive in how he wants to represent America, as he said, in his cabinet and his other posts that he gets to pick in the government. And he's optimistic that he can work with others, even if they're really, really different. So that's more of, I think that this would be the attributes I would give as his leadership style. And that means he's going to invite, for example, experts into his inner circle. He wants to hear from people that have different opinions. He's going to invite Republicans to give their input at different times. He's going to invite centrists and others into his, and I think the left and the right, into his inner circle to give him advice. Whereas if you think about other leadership styles that are more authoritarian, would be the style, right? Where you don't really want too many contending views in the room, or you want those that agree with you. Or if you look at Trump's style, right? He was not, and he appointed people to his cabinet who weren't bureaucratic per se. They had not been, a lot of them had not been in government before. He often appointed folks to his cabinet that really stood for the opposite of what they were, like Scott Pruitt and the EPA, of what they were enshrined to do with that institution. So we see a really different leadership style coming in here. Now, how this is going to work in such a contentious domestic environment is going to be interesting, because of course under Obama was a totally different time in many ways than it is today. So we'll be waiting to see how that works actually in government, in the Senate, with the Senate, in the government, with such a contentious environment. I think his issues, as we already mentioned some of them, but climate change, I think he's prioritizing that in a way that we haven't seen and that's necessary. He's going to prioritize cooperation, soft power, and then I think engagement and intervention, honestly. I think he sees the world as that the US can have an impact in the world and should take a stand in the world in a way that we haven't seen under Trump, because Trump was, again, more America first and pulled back from American leadership. So I thought I'd just look at a couple of his early picks, and then we'll turn the floor over to my colleagues here to say, what does that say about his leadership style and his choices? Because one of the first things that a president, before he's even inaugurated here, he's already picking who his key advisors are that are going to be in his cabinet. He's picked more than these. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them that I think are relevant for foreign policy. And it kind of starts to show where he's thinking, where he's, how his leadership's going to go, the kinds of people he surrounds himself with are the types that are going to give him certain kinds of advice. So I just wanted to, I'm only going to contrast this first pick because I think it's very important for foreign policy, which is Secretary of State. So if you look at the difference between Trump, who had 2 Secretary of States during his 1 term of office, which is unusual, let's put it that way, and contrast that with Biden's pick, who we know is Tony Blinken. So Trump's Secretary of State, of course, the first one was Rex Tillerson, and then currently we have Mike Pompeo. Tillerson, didn't have diplomatic experience or any foreign policy experience per se, except in the corporate world, which he did have quite a bit. He was a CEO of Exxon. He had really close ties with Russia. He had done tons of deals with Russia. He'd been given a special medal by Putin. He was well-versed in oil and gas issues around the world. And so in that case, he did have some limited experience, but he wasn't a diplomat. He was a very non-traditional pick. He was, in fact, the number of votes against his appointment in the Senate, against his confirmation hearing, was the highest ever against a Secretary of State. They're usually confirmed pretty easily. The one before that was Secretary Clinton, who had 14 votes against her. Tillerson had 45 votes against him out of 100. And during his little short time there, he was fired in 2017, so not that long after he was appointed. Lots of shakeups happened within the State Department itself. 60% of the high-ranking, these are careerists, these are people that have worked that are through many administrations, resigned. So there's lots of openings in the State Department. There's currently are still lots of openings in the State Department right now. It's a great time to apply to the State Department if you're interested, because there's so many openings, lots of turnover under the Trump administration. So when he had a fallout with Trump, as many of Trump's inner circle did early on, and in 2017 he was fired via tweet and was replaced by Mike Pompeo, who was the former CIA director. Another unusual move, to move a person from CIA to state. Think about it, national security and intelligence going to the chief diplomat of our country. Very different, usually different resumes here. So that's kind of where we're coming from, as opposed to Tony Blinken. So Tony Blinken's been around in government a long time, kind of like Biden, actually. He's worked with Biden for several decades. He was his first job in Washington actually was as, well, first he worked at the Clinton administration, then he worked in the White House as Biden's close advisor. So he's worked with him for a long time. Under the Obama administration, he was the Deputy Secretary of State. Okay, that just tells you something right there. He's choosing an expert, a person who's already, basically that's second in command to Secretary of State. So he's choosing an expert who's already, been close up and personal with the job. He's also an interesting person. If you read about him, his story, he was, his mother remarried and he married a Holocaust survivor and they moved to Paris. He has strong feelings about human rights. He lived in Paris as a young person, so he speaks fluent French. He sees the world very much through European eyes in some ways. So I think that the pick kind of showcases Biden's hope to renew European alliances. And he's been described as an interventionist and an internationalist, someone who really regrets that the US didn't do more during the Syrian conflict, for example, and intervene. So that's just an example that shows that we're looking at more of an internationalist perspective. If you look at what Blinken's kind of priorities are then, and what this means for, I think, Biden's picks moving forward, because he's picked some other people, I put them up here, I'm not gonna talk about all of them, but it shows that there's gonna be a focus on Europe, which was totally not the case during the Trump administration. He's interested in experts and people with experience and government experience from the past. And then the personal background, I think, of many of these folks and many of his picks here show that he's interested in people that have passions and views that are influenced by their lived experience. Okay, so I think Trump also had that. He also picked people who had passions and views on their lived experiences, but it was totally different kind of approach, a different type of experience and viewpoints. I couldn't really end here without talking about Kamala Harris. I mean, I think this says a lot about Biden and his approach. In many ways, we've never had a female vice president, and in many ways, that's the right-hand person when it comes to foreign policy. I think over time, the vice president's taken on quite a bit of the role of foreign policy, actually, and done a lot more over the last, if you think about it, the last 2 decades, think of Dick Cheney, obviously probably the biggest influence in the Bush administration when it comes to foreign policy, and really expanded that role of the vice president. So Kamala Harris is stepping into that role, the highest ranking female person we've ever seen in this role. So what that's going to bring to it, I think, is going to be exciting and different, and we'll see where this leads. If you look at where she stands on foreign policy, she doesn't have as much foreign policy experience as obviously as Blinken or some of his other appointments, but she tends to focus on something she calls smart diplomacy, which is really about, more of a strategic approach to internationalism. She's focused on women around the world and made this a priority in her foreign policy goals. She's also in the center in many ways when it comes to foreign policy. maybe center left of Biden a little bit, but they're very much aligned, I think, in their viewpoints. They're not opposite. You know, he didn't pick a vice president that is really that different from how he sees the world, I don't think. And so it's going to be an interesting, I think, lens to see what is it like to have, you know, a woman in this office, and what is she going to bring to it? And again, as one of his chief advisors, I think, in that role. And then he also picked a woman to be his Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen. Okay, so this was just announced recently. She's the first female Treasury Secretary. She's been around a while. You guys, you know her name probably, right? She was the former chair of Federal Reserve under Obama. She had a lot of influence during the last economic recession. She's very well respected by the left and the right, by Republicans and Democrats, a centrist pick with deep experience in monetary policy, but I think she's appreciated by both sides in a way. And the stock market, as you can tell, is, you know, booming after this. They were happy to see that this was Biden's pick versus someone that might have been more left of center. And so I think these two picks, both of Blinken and Yellen, and honestly, Kamala Harris, we knew he was going to pick a woman, but he picked Kamala Harris versus some of the other women that were the top contenders for that job, shows he's really going down the middle. He's going for centrism all the way. So I just thought we'd leave with a couple questions at the end here, which one is, can the US even recover internationally from Trumpism? We've had 4 years of America first, of retreat, of isolationism. This has damaged some of our relationships with Europe. Can they be repaired with an appointment like Blinken? Will that work? You know, can we really restart those alliances again? I think we can safely say that the US foreign policy and structure and content is going to be more stable, predictable, and organized, because many, you know, with Trump, there was a lot of chaos. That was one of his strategies, was to create chaos. And so you're not going to get that from Biden. And then many have said, is this Obama's third term? Because he's picking up people that were in from the from the Obama administration. Are we going to see more of that as he fills the rest of his cabinet? Or are we going to see some other picks that maybe are a little bit more new or different, or I don't think we're going to see controversy, but you know, something like that. And then, as Daniel Dresner said in a recent op-ed about Biden will make foreign policy boring again, and maybe that's a good thing after the last 4 years. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Skenesny. Your presentation was not boring, even if the Biden administration's foreign policy might be, but that may be desirable. And after the excitement of every day under Trump, we might like the predictability and the expectations being met under Biden. Thanks for that terrific overview. I think anyone who was not aware of a lot of the details of foreign policy and Biden really learned a lot from your talk. And I think it's a great way to kick off our discussion as we move to our second speaker, Professor Scott Siegel, who I've introduced before on this Zoom webinar, so I will not repeat myself. I'm assuming your resume remains the same, Scott. And so I do want to say thanks to him for not only appearing on our foreign policy panel having to do with Europe, but also on our election night analysis, election week analysis a week later. So thank you for your several contributions, Professor Siegel.
Oh, no, thank you for allowing me to participate. This is a lot of fun, and I look forward to more collaboration between our two departments. And I also really just think that these are really fun and great way to introduce our departments and what we study. And yeah, don't worry about a new introduction. Unfortunately, I didn't add any publications to my resume during the COVID crisis, but I'm working on it, I promise you. So actually, my comments aren't going to be surprising enough or unsurprising enough different from Professor Skoneczny's comments about U.S. foreign policy, but I'm not a foreign policy expert as much as more of a European politics guy and international relations theory perspective. So what my goal really here is to sort of outline where we are / were with Trump's foreign policy, and in between all the theatrical moments and all the different embarrassing events in the last 4 years with regard to Trump and foreign policy, whether we can identify any patterns associated with it. And I've thought of 3 isms, and that's isolationism, unilateralism, and authoritarianism. And then I'll talk about the immediate reaction to the Biden election from our allies and adversaries, and then Biden possibilities. What is it going to look like in terms of, is it going to be multilateral liberalism or realist multilateralism? And I'll explain more what I mean by those little wonky terms in a bit. So what are the elements of isolationism? And Professor Skoneczny already covered a lot of this ground, but in my preparation for the slides, I was just like literally Googling every single treaty I could think of that President Trump withdrew from or threatened to withdraw from. And it's their biggest hits. It's the Paris Climate Accord that we all know of. It's the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that has now been replaced with a China-centric trade agreement that excludes the United States. And the JCPOA, which was the agreement to limit Iran's ability to enrich uranium and produce a nuclear weapon. The INF Treaty, which was going to restrict the use of intermediate missiles, nuclear missiles in Europe. Trump accused Russia of violating it, and rather than trying to renegotiate it with Russia, Trump decided to leave it. Just recently, in the last 2 weeks, Trump has pulled the United States out of the Open Skies Treaty, which was a treaty that allowed countries to fly their military aircraft across the territories of the United States and all its signatories to make sure there wasn't a nuclear strike happening. And that was very good for reassurance and maintain peace. And he is just withdrawn from that. He threatened to withdraw from the Universal Postal Union, which is the oldest international organization in the world. The Universal Postal Union is responsible for allowing and permitting packages from one country to travel to another country, and that rates assigned to one country are recognized as legitimate for transport to another country. It enables essentially world commerce to take place, at least in terms of shipping and letters. And he threatened to withdraw from it because he thought Amazon was getting too good of a deal, sort of the same with the US Postal Service. But, and he also, in this case, thought China was getting too good of a deal. And in the end, the rest of the world decided to strike a bargain with him and raise rates for China and other developing countries. He withdrawn the United States from the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and as some of us might know, he just withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization. Apparently, he had 7 demands, and within 6 hours after issuing those demands, he decided to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So even a bit faster when Austria-Hungary issued their demands on Serbia. That only took 30 days for Austria-Hungary to reject Serbia's agreements. He decided to leave in 6 hours. The WHO was there twice. And then NAFTA, which was renegotiated and made, as Professor Cassiola reminded me, into the USMCA agreement. And so that's sort of the pattern that we see. There's also the quote, withdrawal of US troops from Syria and Kurdistan, which was also quite remarkable that he was willing to take US troops out of the Syrian Kurdistan region and stop supporting Kurds in the Syrian part of Kurdistan, or maybe that's a bit problematic for some of you to say, for me to call it that. And as a result, the Kurdish troops who could have been victims of Turkish aggression and were to some extent victims of Turkish aggression. It's not exactly clear whether US troops are really gone. And apparently the Pentagon and the military thought of ways of keeping US troops around and not reducing the overall numbers in that area, which allows me to get into, there's one big thing that was missing here, and that is Afghanistan. And President Trump's efforts to continue to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. You had, of course, multiple resignations from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense and Chief of Staff all resigning because he wanted to remove troops from Afghanistan, and he still seems to be on his quest with the mass resignations or firings of defense officials to pull troops out of Afghanistan, US troops out of Afghanistan before Biden becomes president. But then there are also aspects of unilateralism associated with President Trump. First, his attack on the Iranian General Soleimani at the beginning of 2020. Amazing that that was actually in January of this year, which was threatened the possibility of a regional war as a result of the attacks. And we can only thank Iranian restraint, which probably makes a lot of sense. We can deal with that in the Q&A. His efforts at unilateral diplomacy with North Korea, first threatening to attack it, and his famous slogans of, I forget the one now that he has of Kim Jong-un, and then met him in Singapore and Hanoi and unilaterally decided to cross into the DMZ. He's given Kim Jong-un more attention and recognition and legitimacy than any other US president has ever in history, and has gotten nothing as a result of it. Nuclear weapons continue to be assembled in North Korea. Nuclear tests continue to take place. So in the aspect of actually securing the United States from a possible nuclear attack by North Korea, he's also completely failed. He had early threats to withdraw from NATO. And initially no commitment to Article 5. And Article 5 of the NATO treaty is that an attack on one NATO member is attack on all. In the first year of his presidency, there was a lot of annoyance and grumbling that he wouldn't mention Article 5 in his commitment to NATO. Eventually it was. But there was a lot of concerns that he actually didn't care about NATO and wanted NATO to end. And he's made frequent comments like that of NATO.
Scott, let me just interject. A number of people have put in the chat, if you can move the slides from the side to the center, it will be easier to see.
Like this?
Because we're only seeing in the center Back to the Future, the first slide, and not the outline.
You have to start the presentation.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it wasn't working. Thanks.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. I'm glad you
Now
told
there's
me.
no slides.
Since you've made such good slides, we want people to see them.
Now can you see him? Oh,
No.
Oh, hold on. I think I know.
Try
why
to
it's
share
on.
the screen.
There.
Yeah. Terrific.
Great.
Great.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, here's all the cases of isolationism that I was just reviewing. And then here are all the cases of unilateralism that he was engaged in. He demanded Russia to be included in the G7 to recreate a G8. It was kicked out as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Crimea earlier this decade. The denial of Russian interference in US elections with Putin in Helsinki. That was probably one of the nadir moments in American foreign policy history, when he's actually denying the truthful information that was given to him by US intelligence services that Russia did interfere in the 2016 elections, and decides to, quote, believe Putin over his own intelligence agencies before the entire world and before Vladimir Putin. US-Russian relations under Trump are, I think, a complete mystery until we get access to important videos and memos. And then is unilateral assessment of tariffs, imposition of tariffs on aluminum, steel, on China, the EU, and others, along with considering the European Union as a threat. The movement of the US embassy to Jerusalem without any type of concessions from Israel in order to do that, and the formation of bilateral peace agreements and trade agreements between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. And then also racist attacks on China after the COVID crisis. So it's not only just an example of isolationism and unilateralism, but it's also, of course, one last thing is that his immigration agreements with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, these were agreements that Trump and the US government made with these three countries to make these three countries, quote, safe countries, such that if refugees were coming from these countries and entering Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, they would agree to call their countries safe countries so that they couldn't transit onto the United States. And this was also unilaterally done, even though it's a joke that these three countries would be refugee safe countries. It was an effort by the American administration, the US administration, to limit the flow of refugees from these three countries into the United States. Plus, last element is his pro-authoritarianism. So he definitely sees the world in a transactional way. Do for you based on what you can do for me. And maybe it comes from his history as a real estate developer of some sort. But basically, that's what he saw the world. He didn't see the world as a form of principles, as one in which there's cooperation based on shared values, anything like that. He basically saw the world in terms of, I'll cooperate with you based on what you can do for me. As Professor Skoneczny talked about, very much anti-expertise, again, thought the whole deep state was against him. And I'll talk about the State Department in just a sec. Friendly relations with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And despite Saudi culpability in the assassination of Khashoggi, the journalist Khashoggi, he and his administration have been very friendly with the Saudi government. Ties with Erdogan and close relationships with other right-wing populist leaders like Bolsonaro, Orban of Hungary, Duda of Poland, and arguably Netanyahu of Israel, as well as other authoritarians. He actually was on very friendly relations with President Xi of China before the tariff war began. There are exceptions to his pro-authoritarian message, and that is his sanctions on Hong Kong leaders and Russian individuals under the Magnitsky Act, or something like the Magnitsky Act. And that is an act that allows the United States to impose sanctions on leaders accused of human rights violations and undermining democracy. And what may be kind of an irony of the Trump administration, and was just published in today's New York Times, is, among many others, is that leaders of democracy movements around the world, but especially in Hong Kong, find Trump an ally against the Chinese government and do not trust Biden to defend Hong Kong activists' concerns about slipping authoritarianism and the end of the two-state one country, two systems model for Hong Kong. So many democracy activists have found more of a friend in Trump, sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of argument. The same thing has happened in Russia and elsewhere, where some democracy activists, at least when it comes to China, are a little skeptical of Biden. And then finally is the weakening and the hollowing out of the State Department that Professor Skoneczny mentioned. And I would only agree with her that now is a good time to submit your application to a job with the State Department or internship. It's buildbackbetter.gov now, I think. And even if you don't think you're qualified for a job, I'm sure they'll have internships widely available to you in the next year or two. There are like 100 agencies mentioned there. So I strongly encourage you, if you're so interested, to look at that website and start crafting your career path. So what are the results? What are the results of 4 years of Donald Trump when it comes to foreign policy? Is it permanent harm or just severely damaged? Well, our adversaries have been strengthened, our allies have been estranged, and our soft powers have been diminished. My view is that there is some permanent harm. There some permanent harm that has taken place that is charting the United States and its relationships with other parts of the world into a different direction. And Biden will be limited in his ability to reconstruct or repair some of those relationships. And in some ways they will be repaired, but in other ways there are going to be existential differences that will put different regions of the world further away from the US and reduce US influence in the world. So I see with Biden sort of two streams of thought. And there's an article in The Atlantic that also looked at sort of the differences in Biden's thought and Biden's administration. And that's between sort of a reformist view and maybe like a radical view or revolutionary view. And sort of the radical view is that they're going to restart all of this restart an international liberal order. So restart the spread of democracies, restart globalization, and the strengthening of international institutions. So bring back a strong international liberal order that was sort of the foundation of American power and influence since the 1950s and 1960s. And the examples are that he's going to rejoin the Paris Agreement on his first day. The diplomacy is back argument by the newly UN ambassador nominee, rejoining international institutions. Maybe he's going to be committed to state building in Afghanistan still. We'll see. In his own writings, he said that he wants to end forever wars, so that may not actually happen. He's talked a lot about aid to Central American countries. And what's gotten a lot of attention is this, quote, summit of democracies that he wants to create, or a summit of democracy. And that's where he wants to bring in all the democracies that at least he and others think are our democracies, and rejuvenate a sense of a commitment to human rights and democratic rule and so forth. Global trade agreements, and build on the Bali package in order to create more open and free trade. But the limits are that our US capacity and willingness to be ambitious. The US is going to be in the middle of a deep recession. We are going to have to focus a lot on COVID recovery. There's not a lot of energy in the American population for sort of a energetic liberal order. Half the country still voted for an isolationist president and are very, very skeptical of globalization now, both on the left and the right. So there isn't a lot of oomph behind all of this, behind a sort of multilateral liberalism to bring the United States back, if you will. So the second alternative is more of a realist multilateralism. So it's a focus on core areas of national security, namely China and Russia, and cooperation with key allies. So the examples would be like the Asia pivot, which was part of Obama's foreign policy. And as Professor Skenazy pointed out, is that a lot of the people that were in Obama's administration are now in Biden's future administration. And so it's about containing China and focusing on the Republic of Korea and the Japanese alliances. Europe as a partner, but no longer core aspect of American foreign policy. Instead, it's really about containing China. And there's a lot more discussion about the meaning of the European alliance and NATO. And just today in New York Times, there was an article about a review of what the future of NATO is going to be. And President Macron, as typical French president, has questioned the importance of NATO and said, "What, NATO doesn't have a brain." And NATO has responded by saying, yes, it has a brain, but we have to remain relevant for the next 10, 20 years. And in do so, we have to have major investments. But there are many in the United States and Europe who think like that American and European interests are no longer really aligned in a way. There is that effort to end forever wars, counterterrorism through technology and special forces, and bilateral regional trade agreements. The contraindications to this idea that no, realist multilateralism won't happen, is really what it seems from Biden is a desire for American leadership in the world. And all his speeches on foreign policy lately and after his victory, he does tend to emphasize this idea that America should be a leader in the world. He does seem to have this idea of what you see above is multilateral liberalism, an idea the United States is going to lead the democracies in the world to reconstructing an international liberal order. So I'm not exactly sure that realist multilateralism will win out because of those beliefs. So my conclusion is that Europe will welcome Biden, but move very gradually away and continue to move gradually away from the United States in terms of security issues. But restore transatlantic economic cooperation because they're just two of the richest areas of the world and they both need trade between them. China will be confronted, but China sees a weakened United States without much bite to the USS's bark. Really, China knows that the United States can't do much and won't do much about democracy movements in Hong Kong or the genocide of Uyghurs in Western China, or the treatment of people in Tibet. Really, the United States has no arrows in its quiver to do anything about China and its treatment of others. Israel and the Middle East, there will be gradual US withdrawal from the region, and US-Israeli relations will be extremely poor. There will be some multilateral successes in global climate change to make minimum changes. The US is really going to focus on, and this is what I saw from Biden's article on Foreign Affairs, on internal balancing. Like everything that Biden talks about in terms of America having a strong voice and influence in the world again is about rebuilding at home, like build America back again, is his phrase. I mean, it's all internal focus. And in order for America to have a strong place in the world, it is very little about the role of international institutions and the role of trade agreements and everything. Is that it's really a domestic focused, ironically enough, foreign policy speech. He's going to be focusing on rebuilding the economy, democracy, and society, but really is not likely to succeed because of how dysfunctional our own institutions are here. So my prediction is grand aspirations for a return to an international liberal order with the US at the center will hit cold reality quickly, and we'll soon see the effects of 4 years of severe damage. The effects are there's going to be weaker US influence in the world, although America will still be significant, more regional conflict without US involvement, as shown in Ethiopia today, and confrontation with authoritarian leaders, but no regime change. There will be condemnation of the actions of different authoritarian leaders, but nothing's really going to be done about it. So, I think we can be optimistic that we have someone now, and we will have someone in charge of U.S. foreign policy that is not erratic, that respects expertise, that has some clear goals in mind that are both good for the United States and the rest of the world. But in my view, so much damage has been done in the last 4 years and so much doubt of America as a country committed to democratic rule, especially what you see today in terms of doubts of the US election results, and the fact that the Republican Party is basically a far-right political authoritarian party now. I think there's really little chance for a shift back to the glory years of 2009 and when President Obama was elected. Okay, so those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I'm really glad you were able to make that correction because the slides were extremely clear and informative. And so everyone could see them in their best imagery. And now for our third speaker, someone who has appeared before, and I want to thank Sanjoy Banerjee for not only his appearance at an earlier foreign affairs panel, but also his persistence and perseverance throughout election night. And Sanjoy was there to the end. I was going to say bitter end, but it
It
turned
seemed
out
like that for a while. I think several of us were quite pessimistic at one stage.
absolutely. And even though that's on the recording, so if you want to see your bitter side, you can check out the recording. But let me formally introduce Professor Sanjoy Banerjee of the IR department, who will share his comments on the Biden foreign affairs future.
Okay, so unlike my better organized colleagues, I will not have slides. But what I want to talk about, take on the one hand, a bit more outside-in approach to the U.S. Foreign policy situation, and then also look at sort of the transformation of the United States that's taking place, and not just in terms of the new administration, but in society at large. I want to start with Asia. Of course, the big story in Asia is what has been the big story in Asia for thousands of years, which is China. China is coming back to a world historical role, somewhat proportionate to what it has occupied for most of the last, few millennia. And that in itself is, in some ways, the natural order of things. What is happening is that, unlike the old days of the tribute system, that China's neighbors, China sort of dominated Southeast Asia and East Asia on and off in different parts for thousands of years. But this time that's not happening to the same extent. Japan, obviously in the 20th century, Japan was itself an imperialist fascist power, which did really terrible things to China, which was in very bad shape at the time. But if we put aside the 20th century and look at previous history, China was obviously a much more powerful and influential state and society than Japan. Japanese culture is very influenced by Chinese culture. But now Japan is, does not, at least for the time being, does not accept the natural parenthood of China, as it were, and is very resistant and is strongly allied to the United States to be resistant. And small entities like Taiwan are resistant and are militarily and economically strong enough that they cannot be captured by China without China paying a price. When they're willing to pay that price, there'll be no more independent Taiwan, but the price will not be small. China is trying to exert its influence, indeed pushing back to geographic lines that at least China believes define its historical past, and is facing resistance. It's facing resistance in Southeast Asia. The main physical basis of that resistance is the US Navy. There's not that much the Philippines or Vietnam can really do. Japan itself has somewhat greater military strength. And something is happening that has really never happened before, which is a sort of unfriendly interaction between China and India. Both are ancient civilizations, both are fairly large parts of global civilization, but the Himalayas are high and were an effective barrier between them. And so even though on the map and on land they're close to each other, the difficulty of moving was so great that there was very little military or even economic interaction between them. There was an interaction of ideas. Buddhism, of course, spread from India to China, but there was very limited military interaction and not much economic interaction either. So now they actually are starting to have more of both. There is a fair amount of economic interaction. It's been pulled back somewhat over the last year or so because of the sharply less friendly military interaction. So China in that way finds itself not surrounded. On one side there's Russia, which is not that unfriendly to China, but to its east and to its south, surrounded by hostile, or I don't know exactly what the right word is, but by powers willing to confront it militarily and willing to resist its territorial claims with military backing. And the US and indeed Trump, cognitively Trump may not have had a lot to do with it, but it has happened under his administration. And Pompeo, I think, has done a lot of the work here, has strengthened something that was incipient in the Obama period, but the formation of what is called the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, as they won't call it an alliance. India in particular would not call it an alliance, but there are now regular military exercises and also lots of arms transfers. The US supplied India with 2 drones. That's not a lot of drones, but they're advanced drones. And they were supplied secretly, and the occurrence of the deal was announced only after it had already been effected. So you're seeing sort of increasingly close coordination at the military level. In the Trump administration, a bit of an institution has developed, which is the annual meetings of from the US, the Secretaries of State and Defense, and their Indian counterparts, the foreign and defense ministers. So those meetings have now taken place for 3 years in a row. And it's based on Biden's statements during the campaign. This sort of thing is likely to continue. And China, so the others are pushing back, and China is also pushing back. They took, in the last day or so, particularly hard hit rhetorically at Australia. Now, Australia sent military units to Afghanistan who committed this. They're very small groups of soldiers, but they committed some unbelievable atrocities while they were there, just killing human beings, it seems, for sport. But the Australian military itself sort of belatedly did investigate that, and that's how we know some of the details. And then the Chinese government agency has put out on Twitter what is best described as a Photoshop cartoon. It's a cartoon, but it's made out of pictures of actual photographs stuck together to look like an Australian soldier slashing the throat of a child carrying a lamb. Now, killing children did happen, so it is not outlandish that way, but it's not real, and it's obviously not real. So in that sense, it's best understood as a cartoon. And this has greatly offended Australia, but it also shows the increasing willingness of China to confront the West. Australia is a small country, but it's part of the larger Western world, at a level where it has not really confronted the West before. Every year, China, for decades now, every year China puts out an annual human rights assessment of the US. And how accurate is that? It's not inaccurate. They get their information from US media. So the concrete events all happen. The sweeping statements are, well, sweeping statements about as accurate as other sweeping statements. So however, while there is a office somewhere in Beijing that does that, it has not gotten a lot of attention, not even in China itself. So what we're starting to see, both at the military level and the rhetorical level, a sort of a more powerful China acting as a more powerful China. So China has absorbed the kind of criticisms that Professor Siegel was talking about Uyghurs and Hong Kong. So they're now starting to push back in a way that they have not pushed back in the past. That in the past, they simply, absorbed the criticism, they disagreed with the criticism, but they didn't push back at this higher level. So the global rhetorical environment may be changing. Now for Biden, he comes in, he sees this more powerful China, and not only at the military level, but also at the economic level, as Professor Siegel was saying, China has recently, just a few days ago, in fact, concluded a trade agreement with many of the same countries it's trying to take land and little islands from, East and Southeast Asia. What you have is, oddly enough, this very dense network of trade, which has developed between China and its Eastern and Southeast Asian neighbors, which has delivered great benefits to everyone involved. They have turned it into a trade agreement. And the US had a trade agreement, but it was, and Trump withdrew from it, but it should be noted that Hillary Clinton also said that she would withdraw from it. That American society itself has evolved in a way that it can no longer make these kinds of trade agreements, especially that one which was very heavily corporate influenced. It was an unfortunate feature of the Obama administration that it just allowed, it didn't think through very clearly who would benefit, especially in the United States, who would benefit. So Biden comes in with a militarily tougher, an economically stronger, and even a rhetorically tougher China. That cartoon against Australia will spread, and it'll just, however hypocritical it might be from China's point of view, the facts underlying the cartoon are there. And they were not, it means that Western media, the New York Times, Washington Post, they reported the basic facts, but given the, more than 30 people were killed for really not while there were prisoners murdered, and by a relatively small Australian force that you would think that would be a big news story, but it wasn't. So that ability to manage the global conversation may be fading. The Biden administration comes in confronting all this, and as we've observed, doing so at a time when American society is fractured, and is fractured both in terms of having a right wing, not, relatively non-democratic, it does not accept the Republican Party is still trying to rig the Senate elections in Georgia. They did not do maximum rigging. The Secretary of State was an honest person. Even the governor who got in through rigging himself was not, made some institutionally honest statements. But there's another round of rigging coming. I think people without cards will not be able very easily to vote. They can be harassed, and it's possible that Stacey Abrams will just ride herd and get it all done. But they're going to make it hard for her. So there's the Republican Party, but there's also a new Democratic Party. One of the statements that Biden made was to the African American community, you had my back and now I'm going to have yours. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that the extreme inequalities of that have developed in American society in economic terms, that he's going to do something about? Of course, he's not going to be able to do that very easily. At best, even if the Democrats win both seats in Georgia, it's 50-50 with Kamala Harris breaking the tie. But Joe Manchin one senator who is likely to be Joe Manchin of West Virginia will be enough to stop any kind of redistributive policies. But then, the executive has enormous power. Obama started it, Trump continued it, and Biden could do more. And oddly enough, even under Biden, you could see what could be called an authoritarian trend, which is the growth of executive power in comparison to the other Madisonian institutions. So there's the US having to deal with its domestic issues and still being called upon to create both money and resources to confront these big rising powers, and even just the political attention. Okay, someone like AOC is not going to be super happy to see very little being done to redress inequality in the US, while the US has plenty of time and money to go gallivanting around the world, intervening in various conflicts. I don't know if that's what Biden means by leadership. He's been smart enough not to say what he means by leadership. But it's not going to be leadership as it used to be, even under Obama. And, Obama was also restrained. Obama was not Bush. So I see the US as dealing with a world where other countries have grown stronger. That's not even a bad thing. The world of, roughly 1700, 1750 until 2000 was a very bad world. A world where prosperity and education were concentrated in a very small part of the world, and the rest of it was poor, and all sorts of other bad things would happen. So that's not, from a global point of view, that's not a desirable world. And in some ways, the world is moving away from that. And that's good, but that has political consequences. And so Biden will have to deal with that. And it's not even Trump's fault. A lot of things are Trump's fault, but not that. And so then it's a real creative challenge. I think the Secretary of State he's a smart guy, but his experience does not suit him well to deal with that kind of a challenge. He's sort of European-centric and indeed Eurocentric in his political upbringing. That doesn't mean he can't break out of it. I mean, he's a smart enough guy that he could do that if he needed to, and he will. So what Biden seems to be doing is drawing people with expertise in the world which has passed to deal with the world that is coming. And I'm not sure there is a better strategy available to him bureaucratically. You don't want to put people who don't know what the US institutionally, organizationally can and cannot do, who don't know the mutual understandings already in place, which are the only diplomatic resources that the US has to deal with. So it is better than having the Obama crowd of just bull in a china shop approach to most of the world. Although again, in Asia, he did something that Biden is likely to continue. And finally, speaking of bulls in china shops, the chief scientist of the Iranian nuclear organization got bumped off, apparently got out of his bulletproof car. Somebody's going to have to tell the nuclear scientists of Iran to not get out of their bulletproof car, no matter what happens outside. If the guy had stayed in the car, there'd be no incident, okay? And we wouldn't be worrying about it. We wouldn't be worrying about what Iran is going to do. That's the situation we're in. Israel has been behind this, a lot of assassinations, so they're probably behind this one. But on the other hand, they probably do need the help of a domestic militant organization, of an Iranian militant organization, the MEK, Mujahideen al-Khalq, I think it's called. So then, yeah, Iran didn't really do much in response to having the head of the Revolutionary Guard assassinated. So they might not do much this time either. Rather than telling their nuclear scientists to stay in the damn car. And so we'll see. I mean, that's an example of Israel wanting to throw a spanner in the works of restarting the Iranian nuclear deal. And then the question is, how will Biden react? There's two ways Biden could react. One is to say, I'm not going to let you get away with, to Netanyahu, that I'm not going to let you get away with this. I will simply make extra concessions to Iran and restart the deal as I wanted. Or he could say that, yeah, I wanted to do that, but there's no way I can let the military balance shift against Israel to more than a certain extent. So yeah, you got me. And so which of those two he will choose is hard to say. My guess is the second. If either the Republicans get, either McConnell is back, and if the Democrats win the 2 seats, then, well, the current Senate minority leader is Chuck Schumer, and chances are he won't be overthrown. Okay. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So chances are Schumer won't be overthrown. And then Schumer, Pelosi, and Biden really come out of the old school of the Democratic Party and are likely to maintain a certain minimum military balance, which means Netanyahu's gambit will have worked. So in summary, the world has changed. The US will have to adapt. There's no fundamental reason why it can't work out well for American people. There's no, if the US itself kind of lays back without getting involved in the domestic politics of other countries, without feeling the need to intervene in Syria, then it can probably be managed. In Asia, the question is, it's sort of a classic question in international relations. Can great power war be avoided? chances are it can. That the great power wars that have occurred in the past have not occurred simply by accident. I mean, World War I is sort of the example that haunts the discipline of IR. You didn't have a Hitler there. You didn't have anyone that aggressive. But you still had conditions which don't exist today. It turns out that the leaders in Europe had absolutely no understanding of each other. We know this from reading their internal documents. And there's probably better mutual understanding even between, say, China and the US than there was between Germany and England and Britain. You don't have a lot of what happened in World War I had to do with the military technology of the time. Once you mobilized, you either had to demobilize. I mean, if you mobilize, it means nothing. Your factories are making nothing, and so then you have to use it or lose it. And they decided to use it and lost, more than they imagined. In the world we live in today, nuclear deterrence is fairly well understood. It's understood as dominating everything else. And so I think there is a good chance that each power will simply move incrementally, increasing its own strength as best as it can without drastic military action. And there will be, gradual shifts in the global distribution of power in all kinds of ways without an outright war. And that's really what the world has to manage, how to live with the redistribution of global power without becoming radioactive water vapor. So that's my thought on Biden's future.
Thank you very much. I've looked at our questions, and there are two that struck me to throw out to the whole panel and let whoever would like to respond. You ended up, Professor Banerjee, talking about Iran, and there were a couple of questions about Iran and Biden, and of course the nuclear agreement which Trump withdrew from. So if any of you want to comment further about Iran, another question in which no one has commented on, and I do want to hear someone's thoughts on Latin America. And I guess Scott talked about, or perhaps Amy did, about the safe countries in El Salvador and Guatemala. But what about Latin America as a whole? So whoever would like to speak on either of those, the floor is yours. Go ahead, Scott. You have to unmute.
Yeah, I don't know why it always, anyway. I'll address both of those very quickly. And that is first, the issue of the JCPOA or the P5+1 agreement is sort of indicative of my larger thesis about Trump has imposed so much harm on the world that it's difficult to figure out how Biden brings it all back. And so when it comes to Iran, it's that not only did Trump leave an agreement, but Iran has enriched more uranium and taken more steps to build nuclear, at least enriched uranium. And they certainly will not trust now any agreement that the United States signs on to and say, okay, well, you may want to come back to this agreement, but we see plenty of Republicans that if they were elected president in 4 years would not want to sign on to this agreement. So why should we trust you? And you put us through all of this pain for the last 4 years for no reason, because we were actually complying with the agreement. What are you going to do for me now? And those are two perfectly rational responses by the Iranian government. You don't have to be a fan of their theocracy and their sponsorship of terrorism to agree with that. You could say it's perfectly rational for them to say no. And so there is a huge question, is like, what can Biden possibly offer Iran to bring them back into the agreement, say the United States will abide by it, that won't generate huge backlash here in the United States by saying, oh, you're giving away the entire store. And that's kind of emblematic of every relationship the United States has with almost every region except Europe. Europe, they're just happy that the United States is back. There's nothing that Europe really wants except for the tariffs to come down on French wine, etc. And probably South Korea and Japan are very happy to have a reliable ally. So then that brings me to Latin America. And, you know, unfortunately, Latin America is not often on the United States radar unless populist leftists are coming into power and Marxists are coming into power, or increasingly so, China develops trade relations with South American countries. And what Trump was most concerned about in Latin America, rightly or wrongly, is Venezuela and the disaster, the humanitarian disaster that Venezuela has become, along with the refugees from Central America. It does seem that Biden cares a lot about Central America and conditions in Central America. And it is interesting that in his foreign policy article, he devoted a lot of space to helping countries in the Northern Triangle. So there seems to be, and I don't know enough about Biden to really know if this is true or not, but he seems to be really committed to Central America and trying to put Central America on a path towards development that it hasn't been on for decades. As far as South America, though, is concerned, right now you have a right-wing populist in charge of Brazil who's very popular, no pun intended. And he's really popular because he's given away all this money to people in Brazil during the COVID crisis. And Argentina is sort of upset that it's constantly had to play by American rules over different defaults and so forth. So South America probably will go its own way more and focus on trade relations with China and see its future more with the other countries of the Pacific than the United States.
Let me do something that I know you three would support, but perhaps might be modest enough not to mention. But the longtime foreign minister of Iran is an MA degree holder of the Department of International Relations from San Francisco State. And I think he's held that position for these many years because of his worldwide recognition and respect. And I think the Iranian mullahs do not want to get rid of him because he is their real only contact with the West. And I think it's fascinating to see such an important world diplomat to come from your department. So I thought I would mention that. Amy, do you want to comment on either Iran or Latin America?
No, I agree with what Scott's saying. I mean, I think, you know, kind of what, and Sandra, I agree with my colleagues. I think it's going to be difficult for Biden to do anything, you know, significant with Iran, except for, you know, we don't know what the fallout's going to be right now. So we're kind of playing a waiting game to see how does Iran respond? Are they going to do something with Israel? In which case that would require more of a US response. So I think depending on what happens over the next, month or two, that could alter what Biden's choices are going to be in regards to Iran. But I also echo what Scott's saying about Europe. I mean, yes, the US wants to appeal to Europe, and Europeans were critical in that agreement. And I don't know whether even the European allies are going to get on board with trying to do another agreement. That took a lot of effort, a lot of work. The Senate has to approve any treaty. That's going to be near impossible in the United States right now, I think. So I think it's going to be way more limited in terms of what Biden can do. And that is a lasting impact of the Trump administration. When you withdraw from those major agreements that actually become law, it's hard to rebuild them. in a degree. The executive orders and all those things, those will immediately, I think, be reversed. And some of those relate to immigration. So I think there will be things that will be reversed in regards to Latin America or immigration or policies with Mexico that can be overturned on almost in the first few days if Biden wants to do that in regards to immigration. Changing course on the border wall, those kinds of things, having a more humanitarian approach to the immigration crisis at the border and in regards to the Iron Triangle, et cetera, I think it's definitely on Biden's radar and Harris's, actually.
Let me, Sandra, do you want to say a quick word on Iran?
Before Trump withdrew from the agreement with Iran, Iran's two largest customers for oil were China and India. And what happened is that when Trump first withdrew from the agreement, he created exceptions for China and India and one or two other countries that they could still continue to buy oil from Iran. They just couldn't use US dollars, and ways were found to get around that. So Biden could do that, could restore that without any congressional action.
Okay.
So that's a partial concession he could make. The other thing to notice about Central America is that it reflects incredibly poorly on the United States that there is a problem. In the first, these are really small countries, okay? It's like I'm not sure exactly what the population of Guatemala is, but it's not much more than 10 million. And so you have a small, fairly poor group of countries who would benefit greatly from small expenditures by the US. And still that hasn't happened. It didn't happen under Obama. It didn't happen under Trump. And of course, it's our drug habits that torment them, because they're just geographically an ideal spot for drug dealers. And there's nothing much they can do about it. Their governments can't do anything about it. There's lots of money flowing through, but it's flowing through in the hands of incredibly murderous people. So that the U.S. has, it's very bad that the U.S. has not stepped up to the plate yet and can easily do so. And in fact, strangely enough, if you want, one of my students a couple of years ago wrote a thesis, or at least she did assignments in my class for it, that the U.S. domestic drug policy causes the mess in Central America, which causes the rise of right-wing politics in the U.S., which further causes the mess in drug policy. And it's a vicious cycle, and every step of it is demonstrably true. So her contribution was to draw the cycle. But it's there, and Biden, it's relatively easy with small amounts of money. Biden can do something about that.
Let me interject a few ideas on the rise of China, which has not been mentioned. And I think it would be a good note for viewers to think about as we conclude the session. China now predicts that they will surpass the United States in the size of the economy by 2025. And if they really ramp up their economy and we go into a post-COVID contraction, it will occur before 2025. And the United States will be second in size. That may not be a big deal in the United States, but it will be a really big deal in China. And when they are the world's largest economy, they will play that, to use Sanjoy's category, rhetorical diplomacy will be heated up under a China #1 economy world. The second point about China, which does not get much press in the United States, is their Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi's worldwide effort to make China as significant in the world as the United States economically. And the Belt and Road Initiative could involve as many as 80 countries with billions and billions of dollars, probably trillions, involved around the world. And their influence is even greater than dollars because they actually send people to the partner to build roads and hospitals and schools, and their soft power influence is great. So when you add the recently signed, which a couple of you have mentioned, the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership involving Japan and Australia and Southeast Asian nations, the power of China, Sanjoy called it a global power, but the global power seems to be increasing while ours is not. Any of you want to comment on that as a world future in the next 5 years?
The Belt and Road Initiative really should have worked. It's a very common sense notion that China is very good at building infrastructure. The whole world needs infrastructure. And so if the Chinese go and build roads and railroads and electrical power plants in different parts of the world, it should all be good. For whatever reason, it has not really worked that way so far. One of the biggest investments that is part of the Belt and Road is in Pakistan, or at least the announced investments are big. And that started 5 years ago in 2015. And by 2 years ago, Pakistan was back to the IMF. The repayments came in so early, and the infrastructure that was built is not quite what the country needs. It's what the Chinese can make and not what the country needs. There are Chinese workers in Pakistan. Occasionally they have to beat up Pakistanis, which is not good for soft power. And it has happened now repeatedly that China has gotten engaged with small countries, which it should easily be able to help economically, but it has alienated them with remarkable speed. In part because China has difficulty controlling its parts. I mean, you might think that, with the centralized power that you have under Xi Jinping, it would work, but that centralized power still rests on a base of bureaucratic support who need to be allowed to do what they feel like doing. And once they do that, it alienates other countries. So the Maldive Islands borrowed too much money, and then they had a change of government and they want to get out of that. Small countries which should easily be able to benefit from interaction with China are sort of turning against it. Sri Lanka has had to mortgage one of its ports for 99 years. We haven't heard of these 99-year deals since the colonial era, okay? And so China has the aggregate capacity to do this, but its political bureaucratic system is such that it cannot totally control itself. And that is producing the opposite of soft power. On the whole, China's overall power is its material power minus everybody else's anger and fear of China. And it's obviously not something they have to do from a sheer material point of view, but they know all of that and they still do it. And there's some sort of need at some level, such as at the domestic level, that is being fulfilled by that policy. So for whatever reason, until China can get its act together in terms of dealing with other countries, including very small countries, expansion of China's soft power will be limited.
Okay. I see by the clock that we've gone past our time, and I try very carefully to honor everybody's busy schedules. So I don't want to continue. I had a really key question, which we will have to postpone, and that is the Pentagon and the future of the Pentagon under Biden. And I noticed he hasn't publicized any Secretary of Defense yet. And that's interesting considering the significance of that appointment. To be waiting this long might reveal some struggle in the transition team over Secretary of Defense. But that will have to come another time. So I want to thank our three wonderful panelists from IR, Professor Scott Siegel, Amy Skenesny, and Sanjoy Banerjee. And to our viewers, I look forward to next week, which will be our final session together. And it will be a topic slightly different. Now that the election is over, what can you do to improve your community? And we will have staff members from the Institute of Civic and Community Engagement and my colleague, Professor Ron Hayduk, who will talk about political activism and internships in the community to make the communities better, and a student, an undergraduate student who has served in capacities like the ones we will discuss, who will talk about her experience in the community. So I look forward to joining all of the viewers next Tuesday, December 8th. In the meantime, have a good week and a safe week. As the virus continues to surge in the Bay Area, safety needs to be a primary concern. And thank you, Scott, Amy, and Sanjoy. Good night.
Good night.